The clock on the wall of my small room does not measure time, it dispenses it. Each tick is a measured dose, a steady, indifferent drip into the quiet pool of my remaining days. Tick-tock. It is the only sound that truly belongs here, aside from the whisper of my own breathing and the gentle, weeping sound of rain against the window pane. The rain has been falling since morning, washing the world outside my window into a watercolor of blurred greens and grays. It is a good day for remembering. The rain has a way of softening the edges of the present, making the past feel closer, more tangible, as if it's waiting just on the other side of the glass. My room is sparse, but I have learned to find solace in the absence of things. There is a bed, neatly made, a small table with a water pitcher, a chest of drawers, its dark wood polished to a dull sheen by hands that are not my own. And there is this armchair, a throne of faded chintz that has molded itself to the shape of my bones. From here, I watch the seasons turn. From here, I journey back. The tears that sometimes well in these old eyes, blurring the already blurry world, are not for the hardship. Hardship is as common as dirt. It is the soil from which all lives grow or are buried. No, I do not cry for the pain. I cry because it took me so very long to understand that my life was my own to command. For decades, I was not the author of my own story. I was not even the hero. I was a secondary character, a footnote in a dark family saga written in invisible ink, a secret chapter they tried to tear out and burn. My story only began when I realized I was holding the pen. It all started with a photograph. It rests in my hands now, its corners softened by the passage of more than 60 years. My fingers, gnarled and spotted with age, tremble slightly as they hold it. The paper is thick, substantial, from a time when a photograph was an event, a permanent record. It is not glossy, but has a soft matte finish, the world it captured, rendered in 100 shades of silver, white, and bottomless black. I am in the picture. Or rather, the girl who would one day become me is there. Lily. She is barely 20, standing proudly, if a little nervously, in a simple homemade dress. I remember that dress. My mother, Eleanor, had sewn it herself, her stitches small and brutally efficient, with no room for fancy or flair. It was meant to look respectable, nothing more. The girl in the photo stands with her shoulders back, trying to project a confidence she does not feel. Her hair is neatly pinned, her face is scrubbed clean, and her eyes, my eyes, are wide with a devastating mixture of hope and fear. She is poised on the precipice of her life, believing the world is about to open its arms to her. She does not see the cliff edge just beyond her toes. Beside her stands my mother, Eleanor. Her hand is not resting on my shoulder. It is anchored there, a 5-fingered claim of ownership. Her knuckles are pale. Even in the faded photograph, you can feel the pressure of her grip. She is not smiling. Eleanor rarely smiled. Her face is a mask of grim satisfaction, her lips a thin, unyielding line. She is looking not at the camera, but just past it, as if assessing a future she has meticulously arranged. In her world, there was no room for luck, only for careful, often cruel, calculation. She called it survival. I would later learn to call it by its true name, betrayal. This was the day I received the letter from Sterling Enterprises, the day my mother told me I'd been given the chance of a lifetime. She was right, of course. In her own terrible way, she was always right. It was the chance of a lifetime. It cost me that life, the one the girl in the photograph was dreaming of. It took everything she was and burned it down to ash. I am the woman who rose from those ashes. It is a strange thing to mourn a person you once were, to look at her image and feel a profound sense of loss, a deep and aching pity for her innocence. She had no idea what was coming. She did not understand the nature of the contract being signed on her behalf. My fingertip, the skin as thin as parchment, gently traces the outline of her face. That hopeful, foolish girl. I want to whisper to her through the years, to warn her. Run, I want to say. Run, and don't ever look back. But she cannot hear me. Her fate was sealed in the moment the camera's shutter clicked, trapping her forever in that hopeful pose, my mother's hand a permanent brand upon her shoulder. The clock ticks. The rain falls. And I hold the beginning of my story in my hands, gathering the strength to tell it one last time. The memory floods in, sharp and clear, as if no time has passed at all. The photograph in my lap becomes a window, and I fall through it, back to the house on Maple Street. It was a small house, one of a dozen identical boxes built for the workers of Harmony Creek, but my mother kept it with a ferocity that bordered on religious. The linoleum floors, though worn to a pale yellow in the pathways between the stove and the sink, were scrubbed to a scent of bleach and lemons. There were no decorations on the walls, no frivolous cushions on the chairs. Our life was a study in grim necessity, and the house was its temple. I was standing in the kitchen, the very heart of my mother's domain. The air was thick with the smell of boiling cabbage, a scent that clung to the curtains, to my clothes, to my hair. It was the scent of my childhood, but on that day I held a fragrance that promised to overpower it, the crisp, clean, expensive smell of the letter in my hands. It was from Sterling Enterprises. The paper was thick and creamy, the letterhead embossed with the formidable Sterling S, a symbol as powerful as the flag in our small town. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. I had read the words 3 times, but they still felt like a dream. "I got it, Mama." The words burst out of me, too loud for the quiet, oppressive space of the kitchen. A position as a junior secretary at Sterling Enterprises. Mr. Sterling's personal office. Can you believe it? My mother, Eleanor, did not turn from the stove. She continued her slow, rhythmic stirring of the pot in front of her, the wooden spoon making a soft scraping sound against the metal. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was a sound that set my teeth on edge, a sound of monotonous duty that I suddenly believed I was about to escape forever. For a long moment she said nothing. The silence was a cold hand, squeezing the bright, buoyant joy in my chest. I watched the rigid line of her back, waiting. Finally, the stirring stopped. She placed the spoon down with a precise click, its edge perfectly parallel to the edge of the stove. Then she turned. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held no flicker of excitement for me. They were assessing, weighing. "It's not about believing," she said, her voice holding no more warmth than the chipped formica of the countertop. "It's about deserving, and you don't deserve this, not yet. This has been given to you." The bird in my chest stopped singing. "But I passed the typing test. My shorthand was the fastest." "Trifles." She dismissed my accomplishments with a wave of her hand. "The Sterlings have owned this town since before your grandmother was born. They own the mill, the mines, the land these houses are built on. A job with them isn't a job, Lily. It's security. It's a roof over our heads that won't leak in the spring. It is the guarantee that the grocer will continue to give us credit when the mill is slow. Do you understand the difference?" I did, of course. My whole life had been a lesson in that difference. The difference between the shiny cars the Sterling executives drove and our worn-out shoes. The difference between their children's new coats and my carefully mended hand-me-downs. But I had hoped this job would be about my merits, not just our poverty. "Yes, but..." I tried again, my voice smaller now. "It's a real opportunity for me to make something of myself." This time, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous lit her eyes. She stepped closer, wiping her damp hands on her apron. "An opportunity is something you earn through sweat and sacrifice, Lily. This is a gift, a blessing from a family we are indebted to. Do not be ungrateful." She reached out and adjusted the collar on my blouse, her fingers cold and firm. "You will go there tomorrow, and you will do whatever they ask of you. You will stay later than everyone else. You will anticipate needs before they are spoken. You will be indispensable. That is how women like us survive. You do not cause trouble. You do not have opinions. You serve." It was not advice. It was a catechism, a set of commandments for a life I was only just beginning. The vibrant, hopeful colors of my dream began to bleed out, leaving only a stark, functional gray. My smile, which had felt so wide and genuine only moments before, now felt like a foolish costume. I forced it to stay on my face as I nodded. "Yes, Mama," I said. "I understand." I didn't. Not really. I didn't understand the source of the debt she spoke of, or the chilling finality in her tone. I only understood that my great opportunity was not a ladder to be climbed, but a heavy cloak to be worn. And as I looked at my mother's unyielding face, I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders for the very first time. The Sterling Enterprises building was not just a part of Harmony Creek, it was the town's sun. Everything revolved around it. It was the tallest structure by a dozen stories, a sleek monolith of dark glass and steel that rose from the center of town and scraped the Pennsylvania sky. The other buildings, the brick storefronts and clapboard houses, seemed to crouch in its shadow, paying deference. To walk through its doors was to cross a threshold into another world, a world of quiet, air-conditioned power. My shoes, sensible and freshly polished, made no sound on the marble floor of the lobby. The air itself felt different in here, still and cool, smelling faintly of money and something clean and chemical. People moved with a hushed purpose, their voices low, their expressions serious. I felt like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a grand cathedral, acutely aware of my plain dress and the nervous flutter in my stomach. My mother's words echoed in my head. Be indispensable. Do not cause trouble. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent and swift. My ears popped as we ascended, leaving the noise and grit of the town far below. The doors opened onto a plushly carpeted reception area where a woman with hair like a golden helmet gave me a brief, dismissive smile before gesturing towards a set of imposing mahogany doors. "Mr. Sterling will see you now," she said, her voice as crisp as a new banknote. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. And stopped. The office was bigger than our entire house. One entire wall was a single pane of glass, a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of Harmony Creek. I could see the neat rows of houses on Maple Street, the plume of smoke from the mill, the tiny ant-like figures of people going about their lives. The whole town was laid out like a map, a kingdom under the gaze of its king. The desk was a vast expanse of polished wood, empty except for a single black telephone. The air smelled of rich leather and old books. It was a room designed to make a person feel small. It succeeded. "Miss Thompson." The voice came from my left. I turned, startled. I hadn't even heard him enter. Alistair Sterling stood there, leaning against a bookshelf, watching me. He was exactly as handsome as the newspaper society pages suggested, but they failed to capture the intensity of his presence. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, a sliver of white cuff visible at his wrist. He moved with a languid grace, like a panther, as he pushed off the bookshelf and began to walk towards me. "It is Lily, isn't it?" he said, his smile showing perfect white teeth. "A lovely, simple name." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." My voice came out as a squeak. I cleared my throat, my mother's instructions a frantic chant in my mind. He didn't invite me to sit, but instead began to slowly circle the chair placed in front of his desk, forcing me to turn to follow him. It was a subtle, disorienting maneuver of power. "Your mother, Eleanor," he said, his eyes never leaving my face. "She spoke very highly of you. Said you were a hard worker, eager to please." A cold knot formed in my stomach. My mother had spoken to him about me. It felt less like a recommendation and more like a transaction, a delivery being confirmed. "I am, sir," I managed. "I'll do my best." He stopped directly behind me, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His voice dropped, losing its public, charming tone and becoming a low, intimate whisper that was meant only for me. It slid into my ear like a sliver of ice. "I don't want your best, Lily. I want your loyalty." I froze, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. "I want to know," he continued, his voice a soft purr, "that what happens in this office stays in this office, that my calls are private, that my appointments are discreet, that my needs are met without question. This is a family company. We take care of our family." And then I felt it, a weight on my right shoulder. He had placed his hand there. It was not a friendly gesture. It was not a comforting pat. It was the same spot where my mother's hand had rested for the photograph, but the meaning was worlds apart. Eleanor's grip had been one of grim command. This was different. This was a touch of possession. It was as if he had placed a seal upon me, marking me as his property. A violent shudder went through me, a desperate urge to flinch away, to leap from the chair and run from that silent, suffocating room. But my mother's face flashed in my mind, her eyes cold and warning. Do not be ungrateful. Do whatever they ask. My body went rigid. I forced myself to sit perfectly still, to endure the weight of his hand, the feel of his fingers pressing lightly into my shoulder, the heat of his presence behind me. 1,000 tiny needles prickled across my skin. It was the moment the unspoken part of my job description became terrifyingly clear. The normal world, with its simple hopes and dreams, ended in that instant. The door of the cage had swung shut, and the lock had just clicked into place. The hand was gone, but its ghost remained. For the rest of that first day, and for all the days that followed, I could feel the phantom pressure of Alistair Sterling's fingers on my shoulder. It was a constant, chilling reminder of the unspoken terms of my employment. My mother had told me to be grateful. I learned, with a speed that terrified me, what the price of that gratitude was. At first, the poison was administered in tiny, almost deniable doses. In public, in the hallowed, carpeted halls of the executive floor, Alistair was the perfect boss. He was charming, professional, and he praised me in front of others. "Lily is a godsend," he would boom to a passing executive. "Incredibly efficient. I don't know how I ever managed without her." Each public compliment was a new thread in the web he was weaving around me. It established me as competent, as trusted, as his. It was a performance for the world, designed to make any future complaint of mine seem like the ravings of a hysterical, ungrateful girl. The private moments were different. The first time it happened, he was standing behind my chair, dictating a letter. As he reached across my desk for a file, the back of his hand brushed against my lower back, a lingering, deliberate stroke that was over in an instant. I flinched, my entire body going rigid. "Pardon me, Lily," he said smoothly, his eyes on the file, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was an accident, an awkward reach, nothing more. But a few days later, as he passed me in the narrow space between my desk and the wall, his fingers grazed my arm from elbow to wrist. Then came the way he would stand too close, his presence a suffocating heat at my back as I typed. These were slivers of intimidation, too small and too brief to protest. What could I say? "Excuse me, sir, but you accidentally touched me?" I would sound insane. And so I learned to hold my body perfectly still, to make myself smaller, to anticipate his movements, and try to stay out of his path. The vast office became a chessboard where I was always in check. The true nature of my servitude was revealed on a rainy Tuesday, about a month into my tenure. We were working on a major quarterly report. It was an excuse I see now, but at the time, it felt legitimate. One by one, the other offices on the floor went dark. The cleaning crew came and went, their vacuum cleaner a comforting, normal sound in the deepening twilight. Finally, even the helmet-haired receptionist packed her things, giving me a look that was a mixture of pity and contempt. Then it was just the two of us, alone on the top floor of the silent building, the rain lashing against the great window. He was a master of a certain kind of charm, the kind that coats a threat in kindness. He had coffee brought up for me. He spoke of his own father, how he had worked these same late hours to build the company. He created a false sense of shared purpose, of two soldiers in a trench together. I almost believed it. My exhaustion was a heavy blanket, my mother's voice a constant hum in my ears. Be indispensable. Then he stood up and walked to the heavy mahogany door. And with a soft, final click, he turned the lock. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the tomb-like silence of the office, it was a gunshot. Every muscle in my body seized. The blood drained from my face and the coffee cup rattled in its saucer as my hand began to shake. I stared at him, my throat closing up, my polite, secretarial smile frozen on my face like a death mask. He turned from the door, and the mask of the charming, hard-working boss was gone. The man looking at me now was the man I had sensed on that first day, the hunter. He never raised his voice. He never had to. The abuse was quiet. It was in the locked door, the rain on the window, the way he looked at me like I was simply another one of his possessions, a piece of office equipment to be used at his convenience. I don't remember the walk home. I must have put on my coat. I must have ridden the elevator and walked through the empty lobby, but my memory of it is a black hole. The next thing I knew, I was standing in our small, dark bathroom, scrubbing my skin under water as hot as I could stand, the cheap bar of soap in my hand, trying to wash away a stain that wasn't on the surface. It was inside me. I felt disconnected from my own limbs, a ghost piloting a body that no longer felt like my own. The next morning it was there, lying on the green blotter of my desk, catching the morning light, a single pearl earring. It was perfect, luminous and exquisitely beautiful, and it was the most obscene thing I had ever seen. It was not a gift. It was a receipt, a trophy, a brand. My stomach churned, and for a moment I thought I would be sick right there on the expensive carpet. I looked at it, and I didn't see a jewel. I saw a spider, a pale, milky creature lying in wait. My hands shaking, I swept it into a tissue. I could not wear it. I could not throw it away. To discard it would be an act of defiance, and I could not imagine the consequences of that. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one filled with old, forgotten stationery, and I pushed the tissue-wrapped pearl into the deepest, darkest corner. There it stayed, a secret, shameful relic. Proof of the debt I was paying, the price of my mother's idea of gratitude. The pearl remained in the back of my desk drawer, a cold, hard secret. And in the days that followed, I became a secret myself, even from my own body. I moved through my life like a well-rehearsed automaton. I woke, I dressed, I walked to the towering glass building that felt more like my tomb than my office. I typed letters, answered the phone, and smiled my hollow, secretarial smile. My hands performed their duties with flawless precision, even as my mind floated somewhere above, a detached observer watching a silent, black-and-white film of a girl's life unraveling. The world lost its color. Food lost its taste. The boiled cabbage and potatoes my mother served for dinner were just textures in my mouth, fuel to be consumed to keep the machine of my body functioning for another day. At night, sleep was not a refuge but a continuation of the horror. I would wake in the darkness of my small room, my heart pounding, the phantom sensation of his hand on my shoulder, the ghost of his voice in my ear. I was trapped, and the walls of my prison were not made of steel and concrete, but of silence and shame. This silence was a poison, and it was beginning to eat me alive from the inside out. I knew I couldn't hold it in forever. It happened on a Thursday. The air in the kitchen was thick and heavy, the only sounds the ticking of the clock and the metallic scrape of our forks against the cheap ceramic plates. My mother ate with her usual grim efficiency, her focus entirely on the task of finishing her meal. I, on the other hand, was merely pushing a piece of boiled ham around my plate, carving patterns in the mashed potatoes. The lump in my throat was so large I knew I couldn't swallow a single bite. I could feel her watching me, her gaze a tangible weight. "You're wasting food," she stated, not as a question, but as an accusation. My fork clattered against my plate. The sound was a crack in the dam of my composure. I couldn't hold it back any longer. "Mama." My voice was a choked whisper, a sound so fragile I barely recognized it as my own. "Mr. Sterling, he isn't a good man. The things he expects." Eleanor didn't look up. She calmly speared a piece of ham with her fork and brought it to her mouth, chewing with slow, deliberate movements. The simple domestic act was a profound dismissal, a clear statement that my burgeoning crisis was less important than her dinner. After she swallowed, she spoke, her eyes still fixed on her plate. "Is he paying you on time?" The question was so unexpected, so brutally practical, it felt like a slap. I stared at her, bewildered. "What?" "The pay," she repeated, her voice flat. "Does it come on the 1st and the 15th as promised? Is the roof still over our heads? Is there food in this kitchen?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, hot and shameful. "That's not what I mean." My voice broke, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "He touches me when everyone else is gone. He makes me stay." This time she stopped. She placed her knife and fork down on her plate, perfectly aligned. She picked up her paper napkin, dabbed at the corners of her mouth, and then folded it neatly, placing it beside her plate. Every movement was precise, controlled, and utterly devoid of emotion. Finally, she lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes were not soft with sympathy or hot with anger. They were as cold and hard as river stones. "Men of power have needs, Lily," she said, her voice low and even. "It has always been this way. Your job, the job that keeps us from the gutter, is to be of service. Mr. Sterling is a generous man. He gave you a position his own friends' daughters would have killed for. He is ensuring our survival." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze pinning me to my chair. "So you will go to work tomorrow. You will smile? You will put that pearl earring he gave you in your ear so he knows you are not a fool, and you will be grateful for the position you are in." The words were like ice picks, driving into me one by one. "Do you hear me? You are not to ruin this for us with your childish feelings." The air left my lungs. The kitchen, my home, suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on earth. The monster wasn't just in the gleaming office on the top floor. A different, more terrible kind of monster was sitting right across from me, wearing my mother's face. She wasn't just failing to protect me. She was ordering me back into the cage. She was handing the key to my abuser. A vast, empty chasm opened up inside me. It was the space where my hope had been, my last desperate hope that my own mother would save me. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. My tears had dried up, frozen by the glacial cold of her words. After a moment of silence, she picked up her fork and resumed her meal as if the conversation had never happened, as if I hadn't just confessed the desecration of my soul. I sat there staring at my uneaten food and understood with chilling clarity that I was completely and utterly alone. After my mother's counsel, the four walls of our house on Maple Street became a suffocating box of judgment. But I soon learned that the prison was much larger than that. The invisible bars extended to the very edges of Harmony Creek. My mother's betrayal had been a private horror. The town's betrayal was a public, silent shunning that followed me everywhere I went. Harmony Creek had always been a place where everyone knew everyone's business. It was a town of front porch gossip and over-the-fence pleasantries. But overnight, I became a ghost. Mr. Henderson, the portly, kind-faced man at the grocery store who had known me since I was a little girl and always slipped a piece of hard candy into my bag, suddenly found the shelves of canned beans fascinating whenever I approached the counter. His gruff, "That'll be $2.50, spoken to a spot somewhere over my shoulder, replaced the usual cheerful chatter about the weather. The change was everywhere. Neighbors who used to wave from their gardens would suddenly bend to furiously weed a patch of dirt as I walked by. The women my mother played bridge with would offer tight, thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes, their conversation halting until I was out of earshot. It was a coordinated, silent effort. No one ever said an unkind word to me. They didn't have to. Their silence was a weapon, a collective turning of the back that was more wounding than any insult. It was a town-wide conspiracy of looking away. The most cutting cruelty came from the other women, the ones who occupied the upper echelons of the Sterling hierarchy, the wives of the other executives. I would see them sometimes, leaving the one expensive dress shop on Main Street or meeting for lunch at the cafe with the white tablecloths, their laughter bright and brittle. When they saw me, a chill would descend. Their laughter would stop, their smiles would vanish, and they would look at me with cold, knowing stares. It was a look of profound contempt, but laced with something else. A warning. It was the look of insiders guarding the secrets of the club. They were the gatekeepers of the social order, and their eyes told me exactly where I stood. Outside, in the dirt, a necessary but distasteful part of the system that kept their own lives comfortable. They knew what Alistair was, and they despised me for it, not him. The confirmation of my total isolation came on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was walking home from work, my coat pulled tight against a rising wind that carried the scent of wood smoke and decay. As I waited to cross the street, a gleaming black Cadillac pulled up to the curb. The driver's side door opened, and a woman emerged. It was Catherine Sterling, Alistair's wife. She was breathtakingly beautiful, just as she was in the society pages. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her red coat a slash of brilliant color against the gray day. She was the queen of this town, a figure of grace and envy. But as she stood there for a moment, adjusting her leather gloves, I saw what the photographs never captured. There were faint, dark circles under her eyes, a tension in her jaw, and a brittle, haunted quality to her movements. She was a flawless, exquisitely dressed doll, but a doll whose eyes were empty. For a single electric second, our gazes met across the street. I was a secretary in a threadbare coat. She was the wife of the most powerful man in the state. We were worlds apart. I braced myself for the look of disgust I had come to expect. But that's not what I saw. In that fractional moment before her mask of bored elegance snapped back into place, I saw a flicker of something else. It was not pity. It was not kindness. It was a terrifying, hollow recognition. It was the look of a fellow prisoner, albeit one in a much more gilded cage. She knew. Of course, she knew. The moment passed. She turned without a nod or any sign that she had even seen me, and swept into the dress shop, a small bell chiming her entrance. I stood frozen on the corner, the traffic passing by. It was then that I truly understood. This was not a secret I was keeping. It was a sacrament the entire town observed. Sterling Enterprises was the church, and Alistair was its high priest. The company fed them, clothed them, housed them. In return, the town gave him its silence. It gave him its loyalty. And when he required it, it gave him its daughters. To speak out against him would be to speak out against the very foundation of their lives. It was not just my mother who had sacrificed me on the altar of her survival. The entire town of Harmony Creek was holding me down. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of my prison walls, stretching out to encompass every street, every house, every face in the town I had once called home. The change began subtly, a quiet rebellion staged by my own body. At first, it was a weariness so profound it felt as if my bones were made of lead. I would climb the stairs to my room and have to sit on the edge of the bed, my heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Then came the nausea, a queasy wave that rose with the sun each morning, making the smell of my mother's percolating coffee unbearable. I blamed it on bad nerves, on a stomach bug, on anything but the truth that was quietly, insistently asserting itself in the dark center of my being. My body, the first thing Alistair had taken from me, was now keeping a secret, a terrible record of his crime. Denial is a thin blanket against a winter storm. It offers little warmth and eventually shreds to nothing. The truth became a certainty I could no longer ignore. The trip to the drugstore in the next town was a journey of profound shame. I felt like every person on the street could see my secret, that the word was branded on my forehead. I bought the small, discreet box, hiding it at the bottom of my purse as if it were an illicit weapon, my hand trembling as I paid the cashier. That night, I waited until my mother's rhythmic snoring began to drift from her bedroom. The house was finally safely dark. I crept into the bathroom, the cold linoleum shocking my bare feet. It was a cramped, miserable space. The mirror over the sink was cracked, splitting my reflection into two mismatched halves. The faucet had a persistent drip, a tiny, maddening water torture in the silence. Here, in this small, cold room, I would receive my verdict. I followed the instructions on the box with numb precision, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the plastic stick. Then came the waiting. The 2 minutes stipulated in the instructions stretched into an eternity. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, my arms wrapped around myself, watching the small window on the test as if my life depended on it. And it did. The drip of the faucet, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the thundering of my own heart, these were the only sounds in the world. Slowly, like blood spreading in water, the second pink line appeared. It was faint at first, a ghost of a line, and I prayed it was a trick of the light. But it darkened, solidifying into an undeniable, damning stroke of color. 2 pink lines, a positive result, a death sentence. I gripped the cold, chipped porcelain of the sink to keep myself from falling. I stared at my fractured reflection in the mirror, at the pale face and the wide, terrified eyes of a stranger. In that moment, I understood true despair. It wasn't the memory of Alistair's quiet, predatory voice or the weight of his hand. It wasn't even the chilling memory of my mother's stone-cold eyes. True despair was this. This physical, undeniable proof. A life was growing inside me, a life that would chain me to my abuser forever. It was his brand, not on my skin, but in my very blood. I saw my future laid out before me, a life in the shadows, my child a constant living monument to my shame, binding me to him with a link that could never be broken. I imagined my mother's reaction, a grim satisfaction that the sterling line was now, in some twisted way, part of ours, securing our position for good. The thought of ending it all was not a dramatic burst of emotion, but a calm, seductive whisper. The river that ran at the edge of town, its waters black and cold under the moon. It would be so easy, a few quiet steps in the dark. A moment of shocking cold, and then, peace. An end to the shame, the fear, the suffocating silence of Harmony Creek. My hand went to my still flat stomach, and a wave of revulsion and self-hatred so powerful it buckled my knees washed over me. But as I stared at the pathetic, weeping girl in the cracked mirror, something else stared back. It was a flicker, deep in the eyes of my reflection, a spark of something that was not fear or despair. It was rage, a cold, hard, and diamond-bright rage that had been buried under months of shame. The whisper of the river faded, replaced by a different thought, a different voice. It was a cold, calculating thought that seemed to rise from the deepest, most primal part of my being, a life that would chain me to my abuser forever. The word echoed in my mind. Chain. But chains are made of links. Chains have locks, and locks have keys. What if this child wasn't a chain? What if it was a key? The thought was so audacious, so terrible, it stole my breath. It was a flash of lightning in the darkness of my despair, illuminating a new, terrifying path. This child was not just the evidence of my shame, it was the evidence of his crime. It was his blood, his heir, a biological fact that all his money and all his power could not erase. He was obsessed with his family, his legacy, his precious sterling bloodline. The idea was monstrous, but it took root in the barren soil of my soul and began to grow. The shaking in my hands stopped. I pushed myself up, my back straight. I looked at my reflection again, at both mismatched halves of my face. The tears were gone. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of my stomach, but it was no longer in control. Beside it, a new feeling was taking hold. It was not hope. It was resolve. It was the birth of a war that only I knew had been declared. I didn't know how I would fight it or what weapons I would use. But in the cold, silent bathroom, holding the proof of my supposed ruin, I knew one thing for certain. I had just found my weapon, and I would burn his world to the ground with it. The pact was made in the cold, silent darkness of my bedroom. I had returned from the bathroom, a changed woman, leaving the ghost of the terrified girl I had been weeping on the cold linoleum floor. The world outside my window was the same moon hanging pale in the sky, the same dark, sleeping houses of Harmony Creek. But inside me, a revolution had taken place. The despair that had hollowed me out for months had been cauterized, burned away by the white-hot flame of a purpose so fierce it frightened me. I stood before the small, warped mirror on my dresser. My reflection looked back, a stranger with my own face. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by something I had only ever seen in my mother. A chilling, absolute resolve. The trembling victim was gone. In her place stood a strategist, a soldier. My hand, which had been shaking so violently only moments before, was now steady as I placed it over my still flat stomach. It was no longer a gesture of revulsion or shame. It was a vow. It was the seal on a desperate pact. The words were not spoken aloud. They were a silent, solemn promise forged in the center of my soul, addressed to the tiny, unwelcome life that I now knew I would protect, with the ferocity of a she-wolf. You, I thought, consciously giving the life a name, a personhood separate from its monstrous origin. You are not a curse. You are not a secret. I will not let you be defined by the violence of your conception. That is his sin, not yours. I thought of my own mother, of her cold, pragmatic cruelty, of her willingness to sacrifice her own daughter to appease the ghosts of the past. The bitterness was a sharp, metallic taste in my mouth. I will not be her, I vowed to the unseen life. I will not teach you that survival means servitude. I will not offer you up to keep myself safe. Your life will not be a payment for my own. My body may have been a battlefield, but you are not the spoils of war. You are the survivor. And I will protect you. A new, stunningly clear thought cut through the anger. To protect this child, I could not simply endure. To protect this child, I could not run. Running would mean a life of hiding, of poverty, of forever looking over our shoulder. Alistair Sterling, and men like him, did not simply let go of what they considered theirs. To truly protect this child, I had to do more than survive. I had to win. The final piece of the pact clicked into place, a cold, hard certainty that settled deep in my bones. I will use their rules against them. I will use his pride, his name, his legacy. I will take his power and make it your shield. And if I have to, I will burn their world to the ground to build yours upon its ashes. It was a terrifying promise. The girl I had been would have recoiled in horror from such a cold and ruthless thought. But that girl was gone, and this new woman, the woman in the mirror, knew that you could not fight monsters with polite requests and quiet suffering. You fought them with their own weapons. Fire with fire. My world, which had been shrinking for months, suddenly expanded. Alistair Sterling was no longer an all-powerful god, a force of nature to be weathered. He was an opponent, a man with weaknesses. His arrogance was a weakness. His obsession with his bloodline was a weakness. His belief that I was a silly, helpless girl was his greatest weakness of all. My mother was no longer the source of my deepest pain, but a strategic problem to be solved. The town was no longer a prison, but a landscape, a board on which the game would be played. The pact was made, the war was declared. But wars are not won with promises alone, they are won with action. I crept out of my room and down the dark hallway to the small table where my mother kept the phone book. My hands were no longer shaking as I lifted the heavy book. It felt solid, real, a weapon of a different kind. I carried it back to my room as if it were a sacred text. Sitting on the edge of my bed, under the dim light of my bedside lamp, I flipped through the thin, crinkling pages. My finger ran past the listings for grocers and plumbers and mechanics. I was looking for a different section. Attorneys. My finger stopped on the listings for the county seat, a bigger town 30 miles away, a place outside the immediate shadow of the Sterling Tower, a place where a man's name might not be the only law that mattered. I didn't know any of the names on the page, they were just words, but choosing one, anyone, would be the first step. It was the first bullet being loaded into the chamber. It was the quiet, deliberate act of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be a chapter in someone else's story, she would be the one who wrote the ending. The bus ride to the county seat was a journey into a different country. With every mile that separated me from Harmony Creek, I felt the suffocating weight of the town's silence begin to lift. Here, the Sterling name was just a name, not a law of nature. People on the street did not know my face. Their gazes passed over me without recognition or judgment. For the first time in months, I could breathe. The phone call had been the hardest part, feeding dimes into a payphone outside the bus station, my voice a low murmur as I prayed no one would overhear. I had chosen the name from the phone book almost at random. David Chen. It sounded unassuming, different from the Anglo-Saxon monoliths of the law firms that served the Sterling Empire. His office was on the second floor of a modest brick building, above a hardware store. The contrast with Alistair's domain was so stark it was almost comical. There was no silent elevator, only a creaking wooden staircase. There was no plush carpet, only a scuffed linoleum floor. The office itself was not a monument to power, but a chaotic workshop of the law. Books were crammed into every bookshelf, stacked on the floor, and piled high on the corners of a large, battered wooden desk. The room smelled of old paper, dust, and faintly of the coffee brewing in a machine on a filing cabinet. The window didn't look down on a kingdom. It looked out onto a normal street with cars and pedestrians. It was a human place. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something that was almost hope. David Chen was younger than I expected, perhaps not yet 30. He was dressed in a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his tie slightly loosened. He looked tired, with the weary eyes of a man who worked too many hours for too little pay. But those eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He gestured for me to sit and regarded me with a look of professional compassion mixed with a heavy dose of realism. He had likely heard 100 stories of woe from women in my position. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice gentle but firm, folding his hands on the desk blotter. He assumed, as anyone would, that I was there for one reason. "Before we go any further, I need to be very clear with you. Taking legal action against a man like Alistair Sterling is difficult, to say the least. In a town like Harmony Creek, his influence is absolute. A case like this would come down to your word against his, and his word, I'm sorry to say, is worth more than yours in a court of law there. It is a nearly impossible fight to win." He was trying to protect me, to warn me of the heartbreak and futility of the path he thought I was on. I listened patiently, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I let him finish his entire speech. The old Lily would have crumpled, her last hopes dashed by his pragmatic assessment. But I was not the old Lily. When he was done, I met his weary gaze and spoke, my voice low and steady without a single tremor. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your honesty, but you've misunderstood why I'm here." I paused, letting the statement hang in the air. He leaned forward slightly, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "I'm not here to accuse him of assault," I said. "Not yet." The change in his posture was immediate. The professional weariness vanished, replaced by an intense, focused attention. He was no longer looking at a victim. He was looking at a puzzle. "I am here," I continued, each word chosen with deliberate precision, "to establish paternity for my unborn child. And to secure my child's legal rights." David Chen stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his mind clearly racing, connecting dots I had laid out for him. "Paternity," he repeated, the words sounding foreign in the room. "Child's rights? That would mean, by law, that would mean inheritance rights. Sterling family assets." He looked up from his desk, his eyes wide now with a dawning understanding of the sheer, breathtaking audacity of my strategy. He wasn't just seeing a legal case. He was seeing a brilliant, unexpected move on a chessboard he didn't even know was in play. He is a man obsessed with his family, his name, his bloodline, I said, my voice dropping, laced with the cold fury that had become my fuel. He wanted to own me. He wanted a legacy. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze with all the strength I had gathered in the dark, lonely nights. Well, now he's going to have one, whether he likes it or not. The silence that followed was different from the silences of Harmony Creek. This was a silence of shock, of respect, of a lawyer recognizing a line of attack so unconventional and so potentially devastating that it bordered on genius. A slow smile spread across David Chen's face. It wasn't a smile of humor, but of a craftsman appreciating a finely made and very sharp tool. "Miss Thompson," he said, a new energy in his voice. "I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss." For the first time since that terrible photograph was taken, I was not alone. I had an ally. As I left his cluttered office and walked back down the creaking stairs, I did not feel joy. I felt a grim, steely satisfaction. The first piece of my army was in place. The war had truly begun. Our secret war began with quiet, meticulous planning. David and I would meet, never in Harmony Creek, but in the relative anonymity of the county seat. Sometimes it was in his cluttered office after hours, the only light from his desk lamp throwing long shadows on the walls. Other times it was in the corner booth of a noisy diner, our voices low over cups of cooling coffee, our conversation about legal strategy, a stark contrast to the cheerful chatter around us. I became his primary source of intelligence. I detailed Alistair's schedule, his habits, his monumental pride, his obsession with the Sterling name. I described the other executives, the layout of the office, the subtle hierarchies of power. I was a spy in my own prison, gathering information that might one day be used as a weapon. In return, David explained the law to me in a way I could understand. He spoke of legal precedents, of filing motions, of the long, slow, and expensive process of a court battle. "He'll try to bury us in legal fees, Lily," David warned me during one late-night session, his face etched with concern. "His strategy will be to bleed us dry before we ever see the inside of a courtroom. A paternity test is our goal, but we need more. We need leverage. Something he'll pay anything to keep quiet. Powerful families, powerful companies, they all have secrets. We just need to find the Sterling families." And so David went digging. He wasn't just a lawyer, he became a historian, an archaeologist of old secrets. His excavation site was the county records office, a solemn, dusty repository of the town's entire history. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the air itself was thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten lives. For weeks, he sifted through mountains of brittle documents. He spent hours hunched over massive, leather-bound ledgers containing Sterling Enterprises employment records from a generation ago. He unrolled brittle property deeds and squinted at microfilm, his eyes sore from the strain. He was searching for an anomaly, a crack in the pristine facade of the Sterling family's history. He was looking for a ghost. Most of what he found were dead ends. The Sterlings were meticulous. Their records were clean, their tax filings impeccable. But David was persistent. He believed that no empire was built without bodies being buried somewhere along the way. The breakthrough came on a gray, overcast afternoon. He was deep in the archives, in a section of records from just after the Second World War. He was examining an old payroll ledger when he saw it, a single payment that made his lawyer's instincts scream. It was listed as a severance package, paid out to a low-level secretary. But the amount was staggering, equivalent to 10 years of her salary. It was a king's ransom for a woman in her position at that time. It wasn't severance. It was a silencing. His heart quickening, David cross-referenced the date of the payment with the employee files. He found her record, a young woman who had resigned abruptly due to a family emergency. There was no letter of resignation, no 2 weeks' notice. One day she was there, the next she was gone, her record stamped with a final massive payment. This was the ghost. Now he needed its name. He knew a payment that large would have required a legal release. He moved from the payroll archives to the legal filings, and there, in a dusty box of miscellaneous corporate agreements, he found it. A non-disclosure agreement, signed and sealed, legally binding the recipient to permanent silence regarding her employment and her relationship with the Sterling family. It was the smoking gun. He had found the body David had been looking for. He unfolded the delicate yellowed copy of the document, his eyes scanning for the signature of the recipient, the woman who had been paid to disappear. He expected an unfamiliar name, a stranger he could try to trace. He saw the surname first, and his breath caught in his throat. Thompson. His mind raced. Had Eleanor been involved with the Sterlings for longer than she let on? Was this her secret? He read the first name, and a new, more profound shock went through him. The name on the document, the woman who had signed away her story for a fortune, was not Eleanor. It was Margaret Thompson. David leaned back in his creaky wooden chair, the dusty silence of the archive pressing in on him. He remembered a detail from his first conversation with me, a small piece of my personal history I had offered. He had asked about my family, and I had told him the truth as I knew it. It was just me and my mother. I was an only child, and my mother had no siblings. He stared at the name on the document. Margaret Thompson. My mother's sister. The aunt I never knew I had. The clever, audacious paternity case he had taken on suddenly fractured, revealing a dark, cavernous history beneath it. This was no longer just about Alistair and me. This was a story written in my family's blood, a secret that had been buried for a generation. And my mother, Eleanor, was standing guard over the grave. He carefully made a copy of the document, his hands steady, but his mind reeling. His next meeting with me would not be about legal strategy. It would be about unearthing a ghost. When David called, his voice was different. It had lost its usual calm, lawyerly tone and was replaced by an urgency that sent a chill down my spine. "Lily, you need to come to my office," he said, his voice low. "Now." "I've found something." I held the copy of the document in my hands, but my brain refused to process the words. It was a legal agreement, dated from a generation past, but it was the names that made the world tilt on its axis. The Sterling family, and a signature written in a neat feminine cursive, Margaret Thompson. "I don't understand," I whispered, staring at David across his cluttered desk. "Thompson, that's my name." "But I don't have an aunt. My mother was an only child." David leaned forward, his face grim. "According to this document, she had a sister. A sister who worked as a secretary for Alistair's father. A sister who left her job suddenly and received a payment so large it would have been life-changing. A payment that legally bound her to a lifetime of silence." He let the words sink in. My mind began to race, grabbing at the scattered, confusing pieces of my life and slamming them together into a new, horrific picture. My mother's strange, almost religious reverence for the Sterlings. Her chilling insistence on service, on gratitude. Her cold dismissal of my pain. "This job is keeping us from the gutter. The house on Maple Street, the debt she said we owed." It was never my job. It was a continuation of a job that had started a generation ago. It wasn't an opportunity. It was an inheritance of servitude and shame. The rage that rose in me was so pure and so hot, it burned away any remaining fear. I folded the paper, stood up, and looked at David. "Thank you," I said, my voice a stranger's, cold and clear. "I know what I have to do." The bus ride back to Harmony Creek was a descent into hell. Every familiar landmark was now tainted, haunted. The Sterling Tower was not just a symbol of power, but a tombstone. The whole town felt like a graveyard of secrets. I was no longer just fighting for myself and my unborn child. I was fighting for the ghost of a woman I never knew, my aunt, Margaret. Eleanor was in the kitchen, of course. She was peeling potatoes over the sink, her movements as methodical and predictable as the ticking clock. The familiar, mundane scene filled me with a sudden, violent nausea. My entire life, this woman, this house, this routine, it was all built on a lie, cemented with my aunt's blood and my own silent tears. I walked to the kitchen table and slapped the folded document down on the worn, checkered tablecloth. It landed with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. Eleanor jumped, a potato slipping from her hand and thudding to the floor. "Who was Margaret?" I asked. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a shard of glass. Eleanor stared at the paper as if it were a coiled snake. Her face, for the first time in my life, lost its mask of cold composure. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, terrified gray. Her eyes, wide with a fear I had never seen before, darted from the paper to my face. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "That doesn't matter," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "She was your sister. She worked for Alistair's father, didn't she? And something happened to her. Something they paid you to be silent about for the rest of your life." I took a step closer, leaning over the table, pinning her with my gaze. "This was never about gratitude, was it, Mother? It was a deal. You sent me to that office as a sacrifice. You fed me to the sun to make sure the secret about what his father did to your sister stayed buried forever." A terrible guttural sound escaped her throat, a sob of pure agony that had been trapped inside her for decades. Her icy facade didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces, and the tormented woman she had hidden for so long was finally revealed. "You think you know suffering?" she shrieked, her voice breaking, thick with a lifetime of venom and pain. She sank into a kitchen chair, her body racked with tremors. "Alistair's father, that monster, he didn't just abuse Margaret. He broke her. He left her with nothing but shame, and a child she couldn't bear to bring into the world. My sister, my beautiful sister. She walked into the river a month later. She took her own life." The confession hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. I could barely breathe. "They came to me after the funeral," Eleanor choked out, her face buried in her hands. "The Sterlings." "They offered me a deal. This house, a small income." a life, all in exchange for our silence, for our service. They called it a debt of honor, to make up for the tragedy, a debt to be paid by our family. Her head snapped up, her eyes wild and pleading, searching my face for an understanding I could not give. When Alistair asked for you, all these years later, I saw a chance. I thought you were different. I thought you would be stronger than her, tougher. I thought you would know how to handle it, how to survive it. It was the only way to keep us safe, to keep the deal I made to protect what was left of our family. The ultimate betrayal was finally laid bare. It was worse than I could have ever imagined. I was not just a pawn in a cover-up. I was my aunt's replacement. I was the second sacrifice, offered up by my own mother, who had chosen to serve the monsters who destroyed her family rather than fight them. She looked at me, her face wet with tears, expecting, what? Forgiveness? Absolution? I felt nothing. The space inside me that had once held love for her was now a cold, empty void. The terrible truth had not set me free. It had simply illuminated the true face of my enemy, and it was a face that looked so very much like my own. And in that moment, I knew I had everything I needed to destroy them all. The knowledge of my mother's secret did not break me. It forged the final pieces of my grief and fear into a weapon of diamond-hard resolve. When David and I walked back into the Sterling Enterprises building, I was no longer the frightened girl who had first crossed its threshold. The hushed, intimidating lobby was just a room. The helmet-haired receptionist who stared at me with open hostility was just a woman. I was not there to be judged. I was there to deliver a sentence. We were led to the boardroom. It was a place I had only ever glimpsed, a sanctum of power I was never meant to enter. The room was long and cold, dominated by a single, massive table of dark, polished wood that seemed to absorb all the light. A dozen high-backed leather chairs were arranged around it like tombstones. At the far end, against a backdrop of the city skyline, sat Alistair Sterling. He was not alone. He was flanked by 3 older men in severe, expensive suits, his legal team. They all looked at us with the same expression of bored annoyance. Alistair himself leaned back in his chair, a smug, contemptuous smile on his face. He looked at me as if I were a piece of dirt someone had tracked onto his immaculate floor. "A pathetic shakedown," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He didn't even bother to stand. "Did you really think this would work, Lily? You and your storefront lawyer?" He gestured dismissively at David. David placed his briefcase on the table and opened it with calm, deliberate movements. He didn't rise to the bait. "This is not a shakedown, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice polite, professional, and utterly devoid of intimidation. "It is a legal notification." He slid a single document across the polished surface of the table. "We have irrefutable medical proof of paternity for Lily's unborn child. Your child. We are here today to discuss the child's rights as a direct descendant and beneficiary of the Sterling Family Trust." Alistair actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "You can't be serious." "My father's trust is ironclad. It's untouchable." "It is," David agreed smoothly, a cat toying with a cornered mouse. "And we've reviewed it thoroughly." It is indeed ironclad. It states, and I quote, that any and all natural issue of the primary descendants are entitled to an equal and indivisible share of the estate upon their birth. Your father was very particular about bloodlines, Mr. Sterling. He made no exceptions for children born outside of marriage. The smug look on Alistair's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. His lawyers began to murmur to one another. He was beginning to understand this wasn't going to be as simple as he thought. "So this is it?" Alistair sneered. "You're suing me for child support?" "Oh no," David said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "We are not suing you for child support. And we are not, at this time, suing you for sexual assault or workplace misconduct, though we reserve the right to do so. We are simply here to formally claim your son's birthright." He paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the killing blow. "As part of the discovery for that claim," he continued, "we will, of course, be filing a motion to subpoena the entirety of the Sterling family's historical employment and financial records going back 50 years. We are particularly interested in a substantial and undocumented payment made to one of your father's former employees, a young woman by the name of Margaret Thompson. He let the name hang in the sterile air. Lily's aunt, David clarified unnecessarily. The one who took her own life shortly after leaving your father's employ. I imagine the press, not to mention the IRS, will be very interested in the details of that decades-long cover-up. It would be a terrible stain on the Sterling legacy. It happened. The moment I had dreamed of in the darkest hours of the night. The smug mask of power melted from Alistair Sterling's face. The color drained away, leaving his skin a waxy, sickly white. His eyes darted from David, to me, to his own lawyers, who now stared at him with expressions of pure shock. He had been untouchable for so long he had forgotten he was human. He had forgotten that history has a voice, and that secrets, given enough time, always find their way to the light. He was trapped. Not by my accusation of what he did to me, which he had been prepared to deny, but by the sins of his father, the pride of his family, and the cold, hard letter of his own law. It was my turn. I looked directly at him, down the long, empty expanse of the table. I did not raise my voice. I spoke quietly, forcing him to lean forward, to strain to hear the words that would be the epitaph of his world. You took my body, I said. You took my peace. You took my youth. But you will not take my son's future. He is a Sterling by your own making. His name will be in your family Bible. His portrait will hang in your halls. I let that sink in before I delivered the final, fatal thrust. And he will own a piece of everything you and your father built on the pain of my family. You will not be able to escape him. For the rest of your life, you will see his face in board meetings. You will hear his name when your lawyers read you the quarterly reports. You wanted a legacy, Alistair. Congratulations. My son is your legacy now. I stood up. David closed his briefcase. We turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving Alistair Sterling sitting in stunned, broken silence, a ghost at his own funeral, the king of a poisoned kingdom, left to contemplate the ruins of the empire he had just lost. The war did not end with a public spectacle. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no newspaper headlines detailing the sins of the Sterling family. Alistair was too smart for that. He and his team of lawyers understood the concept of mutually assured destruction. A public battle would ruin him, and it would drag me and my unborn child through a mire of scandal and shame. They surrendered before the first shot was fired in open court. The negotiations were swift, brutal, and conducted entirely through David. Alistair's lawyers offered money, then more money, then a figure that was so large it seemed like a number from a different reality. It was not a settlement, it was an abdication. It was the price of his family's secrets, the cost of his legacy, the ransom for his name. In exchange, I signed a single document, a non-disclosure agreement of my own, promising to never publicly speak of Alistair Sterling or his parentage of my child. He bought my silence, just as his father had bought my aunt's. But there was one crucial difference. My aunt was paid to bury a tragedy. I was paid to build a future. A few years later, that future was my reality. I lived in a house on a hill, overlooking a gentle green valley dotted with farms and forests, 100 miles and a lifetime away from the soot and silence of Harmony Creek. The house was filled with light, its large windows letting in the morning sun, which painted warm yellow squares on the polished hardwood floors. The air smelled of cut grass and the lavender that grew in unruly bushes along the stone path. It was a place of peace, a place I had built not from ashes, but from the ruins of my enemy. From the kitchen window, I watched my son play on the wide green lawn. His name was Ethan. He was 4 years old, a whirlwind of boundless energy and happy shouts. He had Alistair's dark, thick hair, but he had my eyes, and they were filled with a bright, untroubled light that I had fought with every fiber of my being to give him. He chased a bright red ball across the grass, his laughter carrying on the warm afternoon breeze. He was my victory. He was my magnificent, beautiful, undeniable victory. The mailman's truck rumbled up the long driveway, and a short while later I walked out to the mailbox. Among the usual assortment of catalogs and letters was a single, plain, white envelope. The return address, printed in stark black letters, made my heart give a single hard thud against my ribs. Harmony Creek, Convalescent Home. I carried it back into the house, my footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet hall. I sat at my sun-drenched kitchen table and stared at the envelope for a long moment. A message from a ghost, from a world I had worked so hard to escape. With steady fingers, I tore it open. The letter inside was brief, formal, and impersonal. It was a notification informing me, as next of kin, that Eleanor Thompson had passed away peacefully in her sleep the previous morning. There was a second line about arrangements for her few personal effects. That was all. A life of secrets and hard, bitter survival, reduced to 2 typed sentences on a sheet of cheap paper. I folded the letter and held it in my hand. I waited for a feeling to arise. Sadness? Triumph? Anger? But none of them came. The love I had for my mother had died on the floor of our kitchen on the night she had ordered me back to my abuser. The rage I felt for her had been spent in the war I had waged and won. All that was left was a quiet, profound, and weary sense of release. It was the feeling of a final page being turned, of a long and painful book being closed at last. The final chain that linked me to that miserable house on Maple Street had just broken. I was not happy that she was gone. I was not sad. I was simply done. Her story was over, and mine was free to continue. I stood up, walked over to a small wooden desk in the corner of the room, and opened a drawer filled with old receipts and warranties. I placed the folded letter inside and closed it. I did not tear it up. I did not burn it. It was a fact, a piece of history, and it no longer had the power to harm me. It belonged in the dark, with the rest of the past. I turned back to the window. Ethan had tired of his ball and was now intently studying a ladybug on a blade of grass. The sun caught the dark curls of his hair. I smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached all the way to my soul. The ghosts of Harmony Creek were finally gone. They could not reach me here. And so that part of the story ends. The battles were fought, the ghosts were faced, and a life was built. The woman in the beautiful house on the hill lived for many, many years. She watched her son grow from a happy, laughing boy into a kind and thoughtful man. She saw him go to college, fall in love, and build a life of his own, a life untouched by the shadows that had created him. She lived long enough to hold her own grandchildren, to feel their small, trusting hands in hers, and to know that the cycle of pain that had begun with her Aunt Margaret had ended with her. She had won. Now, I sit in this quiet room, an old woman with a lap full of memories. The rain has stopped. A watery, late-afternoon sun is breaking through the clouds, painting pale stripes of light on the floor. The clock on the wall continues its steady, indifferent ticking. It no longer sounds like a countdown, but like a companion, a quiet heartbeat marking the peaceful rhythm of my days. Sometimes I wonder about the lives that were tangled up with mine. Alistair Sterling lived to be an old man, but he died a broken one. He kept his company, but his son, my Ethan, owned a significant piece of it, a constant, silent rebuke sitting on his board of directors, a living monument to his ultimate defeat. His legacy was not one of unblemished power, but a tainted, whispered story of the girl from the wrong side of town who had outmaneuvered him. He lost the only thing he ever truly valued, the myth of his own invincibility. My mother, Eleanor, lived out her days in the nursing home in Harmony Creek, a prisoner of the same silence she had tried to impose on me. In the end, I did not hate her. I simply understood her. She was a woman so terrified of the ghosts of her past that she made a monster of her own future. She chose to serve the system that had destroyed her family, and in the end, it consumed her. Her tragedy was not that she was cruel, but that she was too afraid to be anything else, and me. I look at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I see the face of a woman who has lived a long time. The skin is wrinkled, the hair is white, but the eyes are clear. They are the eyes of a woman who knows her own name. For so long, I believed my victory was in the boardroom, in the legal triumph that brought an empire to its knees. But that wasn't the victory. That was just the battle. The revenge was the tool I used to build my life, but it was not the life itself. I found something so much better than revenge. I found peace, I found it in the quiet mornings in my sunlit kitchen. I found it in the sound of my son's laughter. I raised him with all the fierce, unconditional love that I was never given. I taught him that his worth was not in his name or his blood, but in the strength of his character and the kindness in his heart. I taught him that he was not defined by the violence of his conception, and he grew up knowing he was the product not of hate, but of a ferocious, all-consuming love that had conquered it. My hand, thin and papery, reaches down and picks up the old, faded photograph from my lap. The girl, Lily, with her hopeful, nervous eyes. Her mother, Eleanor, with her hand of iron on her shoulder. I look at this girl for a long moment, this ghost of who I once was. I feel a wave of love and pity for her, but she is no longer me. She was the sacrifice. She was the price of admission. I gently place the photograph face down on the small table beside my chair. The story has been told. The secret is out. I no longer need to look at it. I turn my face toward the window, toward the new, clean light washing over the world. A faint, serene smile touches my lips. The past is a country I have visited, but it is not where I live. My name is Lily Ann Thompson. And I am finally the hero of my own story.